When U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio took the stage at the Munich Security Conference this year, his tone was strikingly different from what many in the room remembered from just 12 months earlier. Last year, Vice President J.D. Vance used the same forum to deliver a sharp rebuke of Europe, questioning its values, its dependency on the United States, and its seriousness as a strategic partner. It rattled allies and raised real questions about where the transatlantic relationship was heading. Rubio's speech this year sounded calmer and somewhat more reassuring, but after a roller coaster year, allies remain skeptical. Is Marco Rubio the good cop of Trump-era foreign policy, or is this quite simply the same message delivered with better manners? See for yourselves. Here's part of what he had to say.
Under President Trump, the United States of America will once again take on the task of renewal and restoration, driven by a vision of a future as proud, as sovereign, and as vital as our civilization's past. And while we are prepared, if necessary, to do this alone, it is our preference and it is our hope to do this together with you, our friends here in Europe.
Let's take a closer look with Daniel Drezner. He's the academic dean and distinguished professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He's been tracking the evolution of U.S. foreign policy and America's alliances for years. Great to have you on the show, Daniel. And let's start with your assessment. What did you make of Rubio's address? Is he really the good cop to Vance's bad cop, or is he just selling the same message in a more palatable way?
Well, the essence of the good cop, bad cop routine is that you're trying to sell the same message. And so, as you said before, mostly what Rubio was doing was sugarcoating the exact same message that J.D. Vance delivered a year ago, which is that from the Trump administration's perspective, they don't think of Europe as strong. They think of Europe as weak. They want Europeans to re-embrace what they see as the sort of hallmark values of Western civilization, which are very heavily grounded in religion, and ethnicity to some extent. And so this is an issue where I think Rubio said it in a more polite way, and he was certainly more diplomatic. But the core message is that the U.S. is going in a certain direction, and it's either the U.S.'s way or the highway.
Some European leaders, though, expressed relief after his remarks. He even received a standing ovation at the security conference there. Are they getting him all wrong then?
I think they were relieved that it wasn't quite as harsh a message as J.D. Vance. And again, it was a better crafted speech. I mean, it opened by referencing the sort of common ties that the U.S. and Europe had. And in contrast to Vance, you could argue that Rubio at least offered some sort of vision of how he thought the transatlantic relationship could work in the future that had some positive elements to it. But that said, to be blunt, it was also a really weird speech, in that the parts of European civilization that Rubio praised, honestly, were pretty imperialist. He basically had a whole section of the speech where he argued for 500 years Europe expanded its borders, and then that stopped after 1945. And that's a demonstration of European weakness, which I think most Europeans would have looked at as and considered it a rather odd statement to make. So there's no denying that the speech went down better than Vance's, but it's also true that if you paused and thought about it for a second, it was really the same message. And also, I would add that this is an administration that talks a lot about saying, pay attention to actions and not words. And so nothing Rubio said was going to erase the fact that, for example, less than a month ago, Donald Trump was talking about taking Greenland. And so I think that the speech will certainly go down better than Vance's did last year. But really, having been at the Munich Security Conference, there was a lot of people basically saying we need to adjust to these new realities. And one of the new realities is we have to de-risk from the United States.
Yeah. Rubio, in his speech, also took aim at the post-Cold War consensus. Let's take a listen and then get back to you.
But the euphoria of this triumph led us to a dangerous delusion that we had entered, quote, the end of history, that every nation would now be a liberal democracy, that the ties formed by trade and by commerce alone would now replace nationhood, that the rules-based global order, an overused term, would now replace the national interest, and that we would now live in a world without borders where everyone became a citizen of the world.
Now, for someone following Rubio's political career, this must be quite a turnaround. Over the past decade, what beliefs, what convictions did he abandon to get here?
Pretty much most of them. If you look and listen to what Marco Rubio said, a dozen years or so ago, those were values that he was pretty much praising. He was an enthusiast of globalization. He thought that the United States should act as the guarantor of the rules-based international order. As Donald Trump rose to power, however, really you saw Rubio, who, say what you will, is an adaptable politician, change the tone of his message to the point where he now sounds, like a full-throated supporter of the more populist Trump agenda. I would say the only through line when it comes to Marco Rubio's foreign policy views from what he thought 15 years ago to now is just a general sense of hawkishness on Latin America. And so you could argue the U.S. action in Venezuela, for example, the Marco Rubio of 2016 and the Marco Rubio of 2026 both would have supported that.
Yeah. Venezuela, of course, a stark example of how he has influenced Trump's foreign policy agenda. But more broadly speaking, what impact has he had so far?
I think the way you can think of Rubio is almost as the last man standing. There aren't a lot of other foreign policy heavyweights in the Trump administration. Trump selected his cabinet and selected his team primarily based on loyalty. Pete Hegseth is not a very serious defense secretary. Rubio occupies both the National Security Advisor and the Secretary of State positions. J.D. Vance certainly has a voice. Susie Wiles, who's the Chief of Staff, also has a voice. But really, you could argue that when it comes to foreign policy, obviously Trump is the final veto player, as it were. But I think Venezuela is an example where Rubio really did take the lead and was able to make the case to Trump that it was worth doing for a whole variety of reasons related to oil. Whereas I think for Rubio, the reason he wanted to get rid of Maduro beyond the intrinsic issue of Maduro's nastiness as a ruler was as a bank shot to put influence and pressure on Cuba by eliminating the source of relatively subsidized Venezuelan energy to the Cuban economy. And you've now seen the U.S. adopt an extremely hawkish position on Cuba as well. I think Rubio is hoping that this can finally be the downfall of the communist regime there.
Yeah, just to give our viewers some context, Cuba is, of course, where Marco Rubio's parents fled to the U.S. from before he was born. What role do the U.S.'s European allies play for him, though?
I think for Rubio, and by the way, again, this is consistent with what we've seen in the national security strategy and the national defense strategy. What I believe that the U.S. wants from Europe is for it to stand up on its own 2 feet and play a more robust role in protecting its own security, whether with respect to Russia or with respect to other threats. Particularly, I think for this Trump administration, what they are paranoid about is the influx of migrants from both Africa and the Middle East region. I mean, this has been something, this is the one through line between Vance and Rubio's speech. They are clearly petrified of mass migration somehow altering the character of European identity. It is, there's no other way to put it. It's a pretty racist message in terms of what they think, where they think European identity comes from.
Yeah, and he spoke, it really stood out to me. He spoke about not wanting his allies to be shackled by guilt and shame, the madness of civilizational erasure, which, to me very much sounds like a dog whistle. Who is he pandering to with this?
I mean, all foreign policy speeches at this point, all high-profile foreign policy speeches by U.S. officials are speeches to an audience of one, and that's Donald Trump. It's worth remembering I was in the audience, and I was at the Munich Security Conference for Rubio's speech. I was there in 2018 when H.R. McMaster, who was Trump's one of Trump's national security advisors, gave a speech where he acknowledged Russian interference in the 2016 election. McMaster was fired within 48 hours of that speech. Trump clearly has no compunction whatsoever about getting rid of officials if he finds that they are somehow contradicting him. So I think as much as the Europeans might have embraced this speech, or at least embraced the speech relative to Vance, Rubio is mostly interested in making sure that Donald Trump is happy. And indeed, from reports I've heard about Rubio's time, he's not really Secretary of State. What he primarily is the National Security Advisor at this point. He wants to be in the White House because the way you stay in Donald Trump's good graces is by staying in the same room as Donald Trump.
Yeah. He, at one point, really put on display the Trump administration's disdain for multilateralism and the rules-based order. Let's have a listen to some of what he had to say on that.
And finally, we can no longer place the so-called global order above the vital interests of our people and our nations. We do not need to abandon the system of international cooperation we authored. And we don't need to dismantle the global institutions of the old order that together we built. But these must be reformed. These must be rebuilt.
This really is where his true colors shows, isn't it? And he effectively says that rules and institutions are optional from here on out. You were in the room. How did that go down?
Well, just to be clear, I was not in the main room. I was in one of the overflow rooms. But I will tell you that the vibe there was less friendly than in the actual main hall, where perhaps people were a touch more diplomatic to what Rubio said. Again, it is a my way or the highway approach by the United States. And we heard this from other U.S. officials in Munich as well, whether you're talking about Republican members of Congress or Michael Waltz, who is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. All of them talked about making international institutions great again, but essentially this requires these institutions be remade in the Trumpian image, which essentially means less funding to them, a smaller remit, and the U.S. can always exercise an escape clause to not be bound by these institutions.
What I also found quite revealing is his travel route after the security conference. He traveled to Slovakia and then Hungary. What does that tell us, in your opinion, about where the U.S.'s real allegiances lie?
Well, again, I would say the Trump administration, again, remember Vance, after I believe his Munich speech, then met with AfD, within Germany to sort of indicate, where he found ideological soulmates. Rubio doing the same thing for much friendlier Trump leaders in Slovakia and Hungary, despite, in particular, I believe, Viktor Orban's significant unpopularity within Hungary, indicates that for the Trump administration, for all the claims that they want other countries to pursue their own national interests, and the U.S. is okay with that, it's very clear that when it comes to Europe, the Trump administration wants to put its thumb on the electoral scale to advantage parties it considers more sympathetic to the MAGA message.
That's Daniel Drezner of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Thank you so much for all those insights. Great to have you on the show today.
Thank you.